Hello, welcome everybody. This is Social Science Commercialization 101, a session in the Aspect annual event. And today we are going to be discussing how social science commercialization is similar and different from normal forms of research commercialization and technology transfer. We have three wonderful panelists today, and I am Horatio Mortimer. I work in the innovation team at LSE, where I've been working off and on in business and engagement and outreach for almost 20 years. LSE is the lead organization in Aspect, which, as you probably know, is a network of universities exploring and collaborating in finding commercial opportunities arising from social science research. Research commercialization at the universities has been well established for a very long time, but within that, social science has been somewhat marginal, and LSE does only social science, so in that sense we're quite well placed to focus on it exclusively when we think about commercialization. Part of Aspect is the Success Programme, and this is a first of its kind opportunity designed to help social scientists with innovative and marketable research ideas to get the training, support and funding to transform those ideas into a business or social enterprise. The programme is open to applications from social sciences researchers across Aspect partners. And so I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves in a minute. But very briefly, we are joined today by Nick Bourne, who is Deputy Director and Head of Commercial Development at Cardiff University, and Morven Fraser-Wolfer is the IP and Innovation Manager at University of Glasgow, and my colleague David I from LSE, who recently joined LSE to head up the innovation team, and he brings an incredible amount of relevant experience, having worked in technology transfer from all angles, but most recently at the University of Hawaii, and I'm sorry to say that poor David has been stranded in Hawaii by the pandemic, and that's where he's joining us from today. So we're going to begin with Morven, and I hope, Morven, you could tell us how and why you came to be working in social science commercialization.
Hi, it's wonderful to be here today, virtually. So I think that I came to research commercialization from a background in industry. I used to work for an intellectual property consultancy, particularly specialising in restructuring and insolvency. And during that role, I saw more businesses than I care to remember who were doing all manner of wonderful things, but sometimes the business model wasn't quite right, or the product wasn't quite in the right niche. And I think that's kind of partly the part of the experience that I bring. I came back to universities. I went to work for Edinburgh Napier University for a time to work as a business engagement manager, and latterly joined the College of Social Sciences at Glasgow as the Aspect broker, working alongside Horatio in his very capable capacity, and recently have joined the commercialization team at the central service, where we're hoping to really turbocharge, I think, social science commercialization.
Right. Thank you. So is social science a big opportunity for research commercialization, do you think it's been neglected?
I think neglected is perhaps maybe the wrong word. I think that commercialization came from the patent system not that long ago. Patents are not something that is necessarily relevant in social sciences, although they can be, dependent on the collaborative opportunities. I think there's a huge opportunity here to really rethink how we approach commercialization and what it's for. For me, commercialization is about getting great research out into the world to impact the populations that we really want to impact. And I think now is the time for building a more inclusive form of commercialization that is currently being pioneered by the Aspect universities, particularly with social sciences, but also with our SHAPE discipline colleagues, to really start to think about what does commercialization mean and how do we help colleagues from across the university in a wide variety of ways to think about what it means for them. I think if we look at COVID-19, this is a multifaceted problem. It's a medical problem. We're all waiting on the vaccine. It's a technology problem. We're currently doing everything via Zoom. It's an arts and culture problem. How do we engage with communities in this time? And it's a social science problem. How do we encourage people to take up the vaccine should the new vaccine work? How do we encourage people to wash their hands? And I think really social science, what it can add at this time is hugely significant, particularly in terms of how social scientists have traditionally collaborated and what types of skills they can bring to this.
So what are the additional challenges then from commercializing social science as opposed to the STEM subjects that have commercialized a lot?
So I think there's still significant challenges in commercializing STEM research, and there's lots of debates about what we should be doing and why we should be doing it. And I think part of this is about really, again, coming back to my original point of what is commercialization about? To me, this is about capturing the value and impact of research and just thinking a little bit differently about that. Part of the challenge, I think, is about building more complex business models, but that's not a challenge that is unique to social science. If we look at the economy as a whole, that's a challenge for everyone. So I think it's something that really academia and industry can work together to start to really tackle that problem. And finally, I think this is about education. How do we involve colleagues from different parts across the university? How do we challenge myths and perceptions and ideas about commercialization? How do we challenge our own conceptions and misconceptions about what's possible, what's not possible, and what could be? And I think that piece around education is absolutely vital to me, for all of us to really think about how we're doing commercialization and what are our overall objectives and our overall goals in that endeavour. And as a sector, I think we need to think about how we're going to do that and what we're going to look like in the next 10, 20 years. So I think that the challenge is really about reaching out, it's about education, and it's about thinking about what we do.
I think at LSE, one of the challenges about commercialization is that so many people who work in social sciences are involved in policy discussions, and so they're a bit trepidatious about getting involved in commercial ventures because it might make them appear to have some interest in something that they're professionally supposed to be disinterested of. I don't know whether you'd agree with that, or I wonder whether either of our other two panelists would have anything to add about the specific challenges to social science commercialization. Nick,
I think.
Sorry, Morgan, were you going to say something?
I was going to point to your own institution. I was going to point to Elitsa, who is on the Success Programme, who has come up with the idea for a trade policy hub. I think that's a fabulous idea. I think that's absolutely fantastic. And I think if we look at our own institutions, we can all see evidence of where what we're doing about policy and what we're not doing. We have our own potential project with evaluability studies, which is really about taking policy and thinking about what its evaluation objectives are and working with stakeholders to make sure that the policy does what it says in the tin. And our wonderful colleague Nai is taking that forward. And I really think that's about thinking really creatively about what do you want your policy work to do. But I'm really keen to hear what Nick has to say from Cardiff.
Yeah, Nick, I mean, can you also tell us a bit about how you come to be working in social science?
Yes, of course. I mean, I think it's very important to recognize any potential conflict of interest. I think whether you make money or not on the back of the outcomes of some research really depends on the end user. We've certainly got some examples where the outcomes have been made free for social good, etc. But I think there are examples then where perhaps some of these toolkits or outcomes are being used commercially in the private sector, where I think it's only fair and reasonable that we should seek to realize the value of what we've created and perhaps look for a fair and reasonable return to the university. And I don't think the two are necessarily mutually exclusive. In terms of my background, yeah, thanks for an interesting question, Rachel. I started life off as a bioscientist undertaking contract research for the agrochemical industry. So I come very much from a bioscience research industry background. Since then, I've been involved for many years in IP commercialization, mainly through traditional routes, including patenting, licensing, and spin-out company formation. But what I have witnessed in more recent years is more of the inclusion of the social sciences in this activity, which I really welcome. Cardiff University structure is based on 3 colleges, which includes a College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. And we support all 3 colleges to the same degree in their IP commercialization endeavors. And we're kind of seeking to apply some of the lessons and experiences we've learned from our STEM activities to the social sciences.
Interesting. And do you find that there are differences in the timelines between STEM and social science?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think the first thing to say, because I think this is really important, is that IP commercialization in general is a long-term, high-risk process. And I think there's very good evidence, particularly from the Russell Group, to support this. So I think universities need to be very clear from the outset what they expect to gain from engagement in this activity. Certainly at Cardiff, we're not in it for the money. I think, if we do this process well, one of the byproducts is that we might make some money out of it, but that's not the prime driver, certainly. The timescales, I think they differ depending on the market sector. So if you're developing a new pharmaceutical product or a therapeutic, all the regulatory and clinical aspects you've got to go through is obviously going to take longer to get to market than perhaps the introduction of something like a new piece of software. But I would say in general that commercialization from the social sciences tends to be shorter. We've got some great examples from our ESRC Impact Acceleration account, which is an extremely valuable source of funding, by the way. Maybe that's something we'll come to talk about later, that have been translated to the marketplace either through consultancy or informing policy, as we've already talked about, or introducing best practice or toolkits, in pretty short order. And there's some really nice examples. I mean, one I particularly like relates to work we conducted on behalf of the Chief Fire Officers Association to assess the performance of incident commanders in training and in operation, which is a very high stress environment. And I think what we found was that what they were doing in practice didn't always reflect the theory and the research evidence. And so what we developed, to cut a long story short, was a kind of a behavior marker system. And now what we're finding is that this has helped them implement the theoretical training in practice. And it's now being implemented by, I think, around 13 fire and rescue services. And this guidance is overseen and supported by the Home Office and the Department of Health. So we're helping to improve performance, at a national level, which I think is good.
Thank you. Yeah, I've just shared a slide showing an outline of that possible timeline. So I wonder whether, moving on to sort of social enterprises, because social science presumably has more opportunities for social enterprises. Do you have experience what are the problems with company formation for research commercialization in terms of social enterprises?
Yeah, I mean, we've got an example which I quite like. It's a company called Evidence to Impact. So it's a not-for-profit spin-out company from the universities of Bristol and Cardiff. So the venture started off life as a medical research council-funded collaboration between the universities, and it was looking at school-based interventions. This was the aim of preventing smoking uptake in adolescence. And the research was very successful. It was published in the Lancet. And the real challenge was, well, how did we roll this out? Because there was a bit of tension between wanting to maintain quality, and yet the research team didn't have the capacity to roll this out wider. And so we ended up setting up a community interest company, which I think is a vehicle that lends itself to social enterprises. So this is a vehicle where the profits are reinvested for the benefit of society rather than shareholders. And it's been trading now for almost 10 years. It's been very successful. We estimate that it's been delivered to something almost like 150,000 12 to 13-year-olds. And
where does the money come from?
Well, it's actually under license to the NHS and local authorities and primary care trusts. So they actually pay to have this delivered. So we estimate that something like 2,500 young people have been dissuaded from taking up smoking. And if you think of the long-term effects of people, taking up smoking that age, the burden on the NHS would be horrendous. And so, I think they can see the benefit. And so the company kind of trains the trainers. And I think it's a nice model. So we're applying it primarily for smoking prevention, but it could equally be applied to drug abuse and so on. And it's been very successful in the UK, and we're starting to roll it out now overseas, particularly in Ireland and Colombia, of all places. But I mean, there's a statement on the company's website, which I really like, and I think is very relevant to what we're talking about today. And basically what it says is that the company seeks to maximize the health benefits for individuals and communities. And it also helps ensure that the world-class public health research that's taking place in many UK universities does not just stop at the point of publication, but is made available in hospitals, classrooms, and communities where it's needed most. And I think that kind of goes to the heart of what today is about.
Mm. It's really interesting. I mean, I think we do often have projects, similar projects like that, where the value is really in saving a lot of money over quite a long period of time. Yeah. And that can be quite a difficult thing to get off the ground.
No, I agree, yes. Yeah.
I wonder whether David or Morgan want to add anything about forming social enterprise companies.
Yeah, I think that Nick gave an excellent example in that anti-smoking campaign, and that ended up being adopted by government agencies, not only in the UK, but in other foreign governments. Where I came from more than 10 years ago, when I was working at...
You may as well, can you tell us a bit about how you came to...
Okay, I'll try to remember to get to this point. So yeah, I came into social science commercialization through a long and winding road, I would say. I spent the first 25 or more years in the high-tech industry in Silicon Valley in Northern California, and where I was engaged in computer industry, software industry and hardware industry, and later the internet service industry. And I was a company executive at large, publicly traded company. Later I did co-founded my own startups several times in the US and twice in China, actually. And expanding into other industries such as medical device industry, as well as medical service industry. And then I was finally persuaded, after so many years, by my mentor at Stanford University to go back and help out my alma mater, Stanford. So in 2008, I started working for universities. So first 6 years at Stanford, and then got recruited to run an office at the City University of Hong Kong. Was there for 4 years and got recruited by University of Hawaii over the last 2 years. And now I'm working for LSE. So it's only in this very last job, in the current job, that I really started working on social science commercialization. But it's not entirely a foreign subject to me. First of all, in terms of my own background, I've got 4 different degrees, and only one is about technology. I have a master's degree in computer science. But the other 3, my undergrad degree in psychology, my MBA from Stanford, and finally a JD degree in law. And I'm also a registered lawyer in California. So 3 out of 4 degrees are really not in the tech field. And so this is really a little bit like coming back home, trying to figure out how to really promote change in social science, how to really expand the impact that we could have from a academic institution to the society. And I would then come back to the example. For example, in Stanford University, I did not work on 2 cases, but I watched one of my colleagues did a wonderful job commercializing 2 different projects. One was actually a licensing deal, licensing to NHS all the way from California. And it was actually a set of training materials, training consumers or regular patients on how to take care of their chronic diseases. So chronic disease management protocol, and a very famous researcher has done a wonderful job putting together training materials, very popular in other parts of the world, and finally was able to construct a very good contract with NHS, and thereby introducing something of value, just like a Nick's anti-smoking kind of a program from Cardiff. It's a wonderful tool, and also it brought significant financial benefits. I can't remember the details, but I do believe it actually was, it ended up earning several $1 million US dollars for Stanford. Another example is a set of training materials, again, but for teachers in order to pass the qualification exams for teacher credential certification. And this is a very highly regulated field in all the different states in the US. And a particular professor was deeply involved in this area and was able to have a blanket licensing agreement signed with Pearson Publishing. Again, a UK institution. And it also was brought into the UK. But the deal had more to do with the US market. However, that particular deal, again, was able to generate several $1 million of income. So both are very good examples of commercialization done in a very favorable way to both, number one, to expand and maximize the impact to society, but through an agency, through a governmental intervention in the middle. And 2, they both made a lot of money. And the money was able to go back into the research and teaching for the university's core mission. So absolutely, we're at LSE where we like to say that part of our job is to convince our academic colleagues that we'd like to help them do academic research and teaching, which are actually compatible with commercialization. We're not trying to say that our only goal is to make money, but just like Nick said, and I think Morven also hit the same point, it should be mutually exclusive, what we do versus what academics do, and it's absolutely compatible. And that is something in terms of dispelling the myth. That's one of the things we need to work on.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, some people have said to me that they think some of the most famous examples of research commercialization have turned out to be gigantic businesses that could be described as social science businesses in terms of social networks and things, and that it's a pity that they didn't actually pay a bit more attention to the social impact of these things, and that maybe there might be some opportunities for that in social science in order to try and redress some of the unintended consequences. I don't know whether you have anything to add to that, but I wanted to move on actually to talking about how the business models that we use for commercializing social science, because it seems like a lot of it seems more naturally to fit into a consultancy model. And I wonder, is there some way of mixing consultancy and product commercialization in social science commercialization?
Yes, I think consultancy is actually a very natural form of commercialization, if you think about that, in social sciences. A lot of our professors are actively sought after by the industry to help them solve a lot of different problems. And a very typical model is through some kind of a consulting arrangement. So that is a very familiar model to most of the academics. And therefore, I think that when we approach the commercialization, one question that often comes into play is this notion of, okay, I have some consultancy engagement with certain people outside the academia. How do I actually keep that and work on perhaps a product-oriented commercialization path? Are these two, again, mutually exclusive, or how do I actually keep them together? And as we, sitting in either TTO or knowledge transfer or knowledge exchange offices, as we approach our constituencies, how do we really present our business model to them? This is where I think I, along with my colleagues at LSE, have tried to figure out, and most likely we describe this situation like a revolving door. Given a particular problem, sometimes it is hard to say at the very beginning, at the outset, whether this particular challenge would take a consultancy approach to solve or would take a standardized product approach to solve. For example, if we have a, let's say, a particular situation, a particular problem, say obesity, which is a social problem that we'll want to solve. Now, we may also have developed a set of tools, maybe online tools to assess the amount of fat in your body, and some kind of a training program for better diet, better exercise program. So that part could be actually standardized into products that to be licensed. But at the same time, depending on the specific clientele or target customers or users. For example, maybe we are dealing with emotionally distressed population after a broken family or substance abuse families, and they tend to produce very undesirable side effects in terms of eating disorder or other issues. Now, for them, they may have a whole bunch of other related issues that you also need to take care of, such that the standardized product licensing approach may not work very well. You may actually need to work with a social agency and look at a lot of other very specific, very niche area of concerns. So it could be actually a blended approach that you need to take some kind of a standardized product or services from your kind of an enterprise or spin out company mentality. You need to take that kind of a product, however, to customize it such that it could be better applied to a particular population, to a particular client's situation. So that delivery mechanism could be very well a consultancy. So that's where it gets a little bit interesting. For example, when we try to put together this Lean Accelerator program in this fall semester at LSE, we intentionally have it such that the students and also academics working in either consultancy arrangement or trying to do their spin out company could actually come in and be trained, because we believe that in the commercialization process, at least the first 50% of your entire commercialization process, you're dealing with very much the same issues. Whether you're approaching the final mechanism, being a consultancy or a spin-out company or a licensing model, the first half of your activities are exactly the same. So we do see the consultancy and the spin-out or licensing model as basically three almost blended into one in the early stage of commercialization process. So we don't want to actually carve it out and make it too much of a silo situation where, when we're approached by any academic, upon hearing their story, where we say, oh, wait, you shouldn't be talking to us, so you should talk to our colleagues over there. So a lot of tossing them over the wall to the other side. We think that we're actually working very closely together, which is a very natural model, and that would allow a more effective and certainly more efficient delivery of our internal services to our internal constituents.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, even in the engineering and manufacturing sectors nowadays, there's a lot more consultancy is kind of built into the model as manufacturing as a service type thing. But I wonder now, I mean, thinking about going back to what we were talking about earlier about social enterprises, and how do you have any thoughts on how you can mix up, if you have, sometimes some of our projects seem to have like a commercial wing and a not-for-profit element to it, and how does one mix those together without getting into trouble? Is there some sort of figure?
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on this earlier, and I think the example that I talked about with the fire or Chief Fire Officers Association, I think is a good one, because I think the feeling was, it doesn't feel right to be making profits on the back of the outcomes of our research, which are helping to train fire officers and so on. So I think what we've done is that in terms of rolling this out to the individual offices, as it were, what we've done is made that freely available, and we've helped with them and we've worked with them, and we have benefited from some research income and some consultancy. But I think then there are other organizations out there who want to take on this in their private capacity. So these are companies that are providing training, and I think in those instances it's not unreasonable for us then to share in some of the upside, as it were. But it is, I think one of the questions that I think often gets asked is that, is IP commercialization the right term? And I think we may need to think a little bit about terminology, because for us, I think it's about taking the outcomes of our research, making sure they're used in some meaningful way. And sometimes you make money on it, sometimes you don't. So it's not commercialization in the strictest sense. But I think it is about realizing the value of what you've produced and recognizing that, as I mentioned earlier, it shouldn't just stop at the stage of publication. We should try to apply that in some meaningful way. But I think as a rule of thumb, I think if there's another organization out there that's making money, that's making profits on the back of our efforts, then I think it's only fair and reasonable that we should look to share in that.
Morgan or David, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think picking up on what Nick was saying, I think it's really important that we think about about what the process is for getting your research out into the world, and that it shouldn't stop at publication. And often, as we all know, what can happen is a toolkit can be made available for free on a website, and then that's kind of the end, and nothing really, no systemic change happens. And I think a lot of our researchers are A, frustrated by that, and B, we need to think about models that actually ensure that toolkit can actually be pulled into the marketplace and used by the populations that we wish to use it, which is why I think Nick's example of evidence the impact is such a great one, because that company's model of really thinking about how we're going to get people to pay for things that really need to be taught, because the cessation rates that evidence to impact have managed to do are absolutely incredible, and I think it's really that. And instead of thinking about profit versus not profit versus all of the kind of various business models that you can choose, I think it's about thinking about how do we pay for the thing that we want to happen, and who's got the money to do so, and then thinking really creatively about how we make that happen. And I think there's loads of models out there in the private sector, and we just need to look a little bit more and think about different ways and innovative ways of doing that very work. And that's on us as TTOs, really, to really get out there and see and connect with different organisations. I know in Scotland there's the Converge Challenge, which is a group that's been set up, and with all 18 institutions across Scotland, where anyone can come forward with a business idea and get support and they can go for a competition to earn money. And that's a really great place to look at the innovative businesses and business models that might underpin what your next idea might look like. And I think it's about that. It's about going out and seeing.
Yes, I totally agree that the word commercialization could be a little bit too narrow to define what we are all about. And I think that both Morgan and Nick have pointed out, it should really be about expanding the impact and making sure that the research results don't just sit on the shelf, and the results are much more than just publication and then moving on to the next research topic. So we'd like to very much to make sure that the results are applied to real life problems and to create societal value. And in that, I think I also like to think that there are at least two different dimensions that we could also talk about in terms of bridging the gap between the nonprofit world, nonprofit/academic world, and the more commercial world where profits are very important. And those two dimensions are, number one, without changing too much of your business model or organizational model, you can already have the same product licensed in two entirely different ways. And one for nonprofit/academic research model, and the other one is for your regular commercial users. And there have been probably several very prominent examples in the computer high-tech industry. One good example is the early stage database product called Ingress, which is actually a spin-out from UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, research group led by Professor Michael Stonebreaker, and who led that. He's a pioneer in a relational database since the 1970s. It's a long history. But what they did with this company called Ingress is very interesting. From the very beginning, they recognized that, as Nick pointed out, that the result was all by academics. So they would like very much for other academic researchers to enjoy the fruit of their research result without having to pay very expensive licensing fees. So they carved out a academic English license. So if you're just an academic or later on expanded to a nonprofit, I believe, you can actually license that software rather cheaply. And as a site license, you can then install it on your server and things like that, while still keeping their commercial operation on an ongoing basis. And simply in the business world, this is called price discrimination. You know, you charge people different prices based on who they are as customers. If you think that is unfair, well, think about this. When you buy a typical airline ticket to go from point A to point B, not everybody pays the same price, not at all. And people are being price discriminated against if they have to have a very short trip, going there and come back within 1 or 2 days. The airline industry already figured out, aha, you are probably a business traveler, and therefore for that itinerary, you have to pay 2 or 3 times more than a typical leisure kind of a customer who actually stays there over a weekend, over a Saturday night stay. So that's actually done all the time. And therefore, in our situation, we may not have to change our product at all, but we could carve out different licensing model to fit different customers. Another, perhaps a little bit more dramatic approach is to change the structure of entities. And in several examples, there are very successful nonprofit operations which actually they have figured out that they almost have to set up a commercial entity separately in order to do their job more effectively. The one good example is Wikipedia. We use a lot of Wikipedia entries, and I look things up using Wikipedia all the time. Now, the content is almost entirely contributed by individual users. Through their goodwill, they like to share their individual knowledge. So they contribute their knowledge to fill Wikipedia with probably the largest collection of human knowledge. So in a way, the operation is all about nonprofit. But in order to operate it more successfully, they have found it necessary to set up a for-profit entity. Because with a for-profit entity in San Francisco on the 9th Avenue, they found out that they could then recruit the best talents by promising them the stock option, by paying them the market rate for their talents, not the typical nonprofit rate, which is really a little bit silly that, oh, just because you work in nonprofit, you don't care about low wages, do you? You should be happy to earn just a fraction of your colleagues working in the for-profit industry. Of course, that's not true. So if you keep that model, you are not going to be very competitive in terms of recruiting talents. So even for almost a defensive reasons, Wikipedia found out that they had to really start a for-profit operation. So the for-profit arm actually operates their daily operation of their entire website of Wikipedia, whereas the original Wikipedia Foundation would continue to drive the education mission, to drive the advocacy mission, and other nonprofit operations, so that people contributing their knowledge to Wikipedia would not feel that they're being exploited. And the reality is that their for-profit operation is actually a very small portion in terms of their overall resources. And it's not hugely profitable either. And another
conscious that we've only got a certain amount of time left, and we've got some really interesting questions in the Q&A. So I want to do that, and then at the end of the session, I'm just going to give you each a chance to, after we've been through the Q&A questions, I'm going to ask you all to give us your top tips for social science commercialization, so you can think about that as well. So first of all, we have a question. What are the challenges with the commercialization of research output when there is no patent, but perhaps more emphasis on softer IP? Nick.
So I think, yeah, I mean, I think there are some challenges. I think if you compare with traditional technology transfer or IP commercialization, particularly I think when you're dealing with investors, certain types of industry, I think they do take a lot of comfort in having the monopoly that a patent confers. But I don't think it's, that's the only way to do it by any means. I think it's really about recognizing the value of what you've created and just looking at it in terms of who will benefit from this, whether it's socially, whether it's financially. A lot of the stuff we've talked about today is covered by copyright, which exists automatically. I think, even the expertise that exists within academic or principal investigator institutions, that can be provided on a confidential basis as well. So I think it's a case of trying to tread a line between wanting to collaborate with the outside world, but not give everything away. Let's not be taken for granted, because I think one of the benefits of commercialization, if we call it that for universities, is very often that profit or returns are actually reinvested in further research, and it raises the profile of what we do. So I think we just have to try to recognize the value of what we're creating, and then have a meaningful conversation with whoever we're dealing with in the outside world to sort of say, there's a value associated with this. We don't want to give it for free. Let's have a discussion about how we might, craft some kind of return. And I think that can be done in the absence of patents. And it relates to anything, any kind of property, not just intellectual property. So
well,
I think
there's also a related question here on whether it makes it more difficult to raise money.
Very probably, but I think all we need, I think you need investors who have broad minds, because I think, as you touched on earlier, Horatio, I think there have been some really great examples like Facebook and and others, which could be classed as social enterprises rather than tech-based businesses. There's certainly a very strong social aspect to them. And I think it's about capturing the imagination of investors. But I know from experience that, the typical investor, I hope I'm not doing anyone a disservice, tends to be, tech-based, patent-based and so on. But I think there are, investors out there now who have got a different approach, whether it's related to patient capital, they're prepared to take a longer view, and are recognizing some of the value of some of these ventures that are created in the modern world.
Yeah, Horatio, if I can add to what Nick's just said, actually, I totally agree. I think there are a number of also social impact investors who are really concerned about what the impact of the research is, and it's about thinking about what those investors want. And again, that comes back to what Nick said. It's about crafting the story and the narrative to ensure that you're hitting the right types of investors. And I noticed that somebody else has asked about brand in terms of softer IP, and I think that's absolutely critical when we're thinking about crafting that narrative and thinking about what the social enterprise or whatever your spin out might look like, whether it might even have profit for good as its mission rather than its legal structure. We can think about that, and we think about creating and crafting a whole brand identity, partly around the team, which is absolutely vital, partly around the trading name of the company, if that can be trademarked, and thinking about a whole intellectual property strategy that really underpins the business. That, I think, is quite attractive to lots of different types of investors, particularly social impact investors, but it's not unattractive to other types of investors. I think the key part there is about thinking overall about what you've got and thinking about what narrative that represents.
And then we've got a question from Zahira Abdulrahman from the University of Sheffield. who's asking about commercialization being a dirty word. And so she says, how do you define commercialization for social sciences? I can imagine many social scientists would see commercialization as almost a dirty word due to the profit-making element attached to the word. How do we change the culture of thinking about commercialization? Do new phrases need to be used?
I think we've touched on this already, and yeah, I think nomenclature does change with time. I mean, I've certainly seen this area referred to as technology transfer in the early days, then it moved to things like knowledge transfer or knowledge exchange. So I think it is important. And I think, of course, impact, which has been hugely important for universities, I think that's become, you know, a very important identifier in this area. So I think it certainly in the social sciences, IP commercialization doesn't always you know, create the best first impression. So I think if it helps get the job done, I mean, it's essentially the same process, maybe with some changes, you know, some nuances. But I wouldn't be unhappy to see some, you know, change in the way we describe what we do, because I certainly think it's happening in practice. I think in the UK and in the US, from what I can see from some US universities.
So, another question, why do you think it has taken so long to recognise the potential for social science commercialisation given the strength of the knowledge economy in the UK? Anyone?
That is, oh, thank you for picking on me. That is a difficult question that I'm not sure that I have the answer to. I don't know if anybody does. I think maybe it's partly to do with how we express what social sciences is. I think with the new drive to have the shape narrative and really thinking about what do social scientists bring to our lives? How do social scientists change our society and our culture and our everyday life, if I'm honest? How do they do that? And I think maybe we haven't been good enough about shouting about the advantages of social science. And I think then it's taken a bit of time to really come around to that from a kind of sector perspective. And I think part of that is some social scientists are a little bit reticent about shouting about how great they are. And I think they need to shout a wee bit louder. And I think that that kind of feeds into that whole problem, really, which isn't really an answer. Apologies. It's more of a comment, I suppose.
Yeah. I think there's a related question saying, is the market aware of the potential and impact of social science research? Which I think is an interesting question. I wonder whether it might have something to do with accounting practices, because I think a lot of business investment goes into intangibles and they aren't really recognized as capital formation. They're more seen, they've just sort of put, you know, things like creating human capital, knowledge capital and social capital are really put in the investments in those. They do build up skills and operations, but they're really included in the cost of doing business. So and they're also very difficult to, when you create these assets, they're quite difficult to then resell. So it makes it, I think that might make it difficult to raise money for those things. But I don't know, do people think that the market is aware of the potential and impact from social science research?
I think you're right, Rachel, but I mean, the only point I'd want to make is it's just one of history, really. I think this is an evolving space. I mean, I can remember when I started off my career as a researcher in the 1980s, sort of working with industry was a bit of a dirty word. And we've come a long, long way, you know, if you look at where we are with UKRI today. And I think, you know, I'm just pleased that social sciences is now being recognised, and there are being some, because I think there's a huge potential there that's yet to be fully recognised.
And then the last question we have here is, how can graduate and PhD students get involved in commercialisation? David.
Well, I think that as we think about the word change, it really is the word that encompasses all the different disciplines that we deal with. And because whenever we talk about impact, in the society, we are talking about a changing process. And if you think of a huge industry, which is a management consulting industry, a lot of successful MBA students would end up being a management consultant out there. What do they do for their clients? They are advising their clients how to go through a changing process, typically, how to identify the need to change, how to facilitate the changing process itself. So the word change is very important. And why do I say that? Because as we try to help our graduate students, master's and PhD level students to learn entrepreneurship, we often say that entrepreneurship should be thought of as a mindset as well as a skill set. A mindset because change is the only constant in life, moving forward. The life around us, especially as we look at this year 2020, I think we have all been totally surprised in terms of the amount of change, the type of change, and the speed of the changes that we're seeing. So we have to learn how to really deal with change. And entrepreneurship is a mentality that you need to deal with the change process. And it's a skill set because you need to be an active actor, facilitating the change, leading the change, becoming an effective change agent. So I think that the one very good way for graduate students to be involved, to learn about the commercialization process. I do agree with both my colleagues that we need to expand beyond the word commercialization. But since the title of our talk today is Commercialization 101, if we want to actually help our graduate students to move on this particular path, the first thing I would say is to get themselves involved in some kind of entrepreneurial project. It could be consultancy, it could be other product-oriented spin-out operation, and learn all they can learn about entrepreneurship.
Great, thank you very much. And Morgan, your top tips.
My top tip, I feel a little strange saying top tip, but never mind. My top tip is education. It is, if you're a TTO person, go out and ask your social scientists if they want to do commercialization, what it actually means. Use examples, and I'd be more than willing to share some that Glasgow has. And if you're a researcher, ask your tech transfer office, ask Research and Innovation Services for help, and just have an open mind. Very generic.
I think for me, it's about raising awareness and promoting success stories. So we need to demonstrate, within your host institution, this activity is valued. And I think this will help change the culture. Advertise success stories on university homepages. There's nothing like a bit of endorsement from your vice chancellor. We run innovation award evenings, that kind of thing. Show that success stories are important. Promote more activity of the same ilk, I think.
Thank you. And David, do you have anything to add?
I think that we don't really work in a silo within the university setting. So as much as possible, we are trying to reach out and connect with other professional services colleagues to bring out what we call the unified service model, because we touch upon and we certainly serve the same internal customers all the time. And as they come in working on a project proposal, a grant proposal with our academic service colleagues, there may be some potential commercialization opportunities. Sometimes we actually go out there to engage, for instance, our alumni to actually come back to campus for talks and sometimes for mentorship and things like that. And there are almost always multiple reasons why our unit, innovation at the LSE, should be involved. So we like very much to promote this notion of a unified service model that would actually make sure that we get the word out and as a friendly professional service unit to our internal customers.
Thank you. Well, that's about all we have time for, I'm afraid. I hope that everyone has enjoyed this session and found it insightful. And we very much hope that you'll be able to join future sessions in the Aspect annual event. We'd be very grateful for your feedback on this session. Once the session's ended, you will be directed to a very short survey, which will take less than a minute to complete. Please let us know what you think. The recording of the session will go live in the coming days, and we'll let you know once it's available. Many thanks, and
Thank you.
goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks to our panelists.